Welcome to the Beehive. We're talking with Jordan from Black Lives Matter about 2.5 minutes in. But first, as always, the theme song.
You're now entering the Beehive with your host, Double B.
Welcome to the Beehive. I'm your host, Double B, aka Bobby. And, this week's episode, I think, is a really important and timely episode. I want to start by just backtracking and giving you a little bit of the story of how this all came to be. So, I'm originally from South Bend, Indiana. And I took a trip back home just kind of as a mental health trip. I've been working from home for the last 3 months and it's totally driving me crazy. And so I just wanted to change the scenery. And at the same time, George Floyd was murdered about 3 weeks ago by a police officer in Minnesota. So, of course, we're all, everyone's thinking about that. And Black Lives Matter is very much in the center of America right now and just everyone's consciousness. So I wanted to see, what is happening in South Bend in regards to equality and dealing with police brutality. My mom had worked with Jordan Geiger, who is a leader of Black Lives Matter in South Bend. So I was lucky enough we were able to connect. And one thing that just struck me about the conversation was how much what's happening in South Bend, Indiana is just kind of a microcosm of what's happening across the whole country. So, we talked about police brutality, we talked about the local issues, we got into it. This is a worthwhile conversation. Welcome to the Beehive. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about you. Like, how did you first get involved in activism and Black Lives Matter, and what drew you to it?
Yeah, so my activism first started as an undergrad at DePaul University in Central Indiana. I was very involved in a number of just university organizations, student organizations, even founded a couple of them. So that's kind of where it first started to take off. But when I graduated in 2013, I moved back to South Bend. I was here for about a year and a half. I was looking for ways to get involved, but didn't really see many opportunities for someone like myself. I'm pretty radical in my thought and my politics. So I was looking for something else. I ended up getting an offer to go and study or to pursue a master's degree at the University of Missouri, Columbia in 2015. So I moved there in August of 2015. While there, I connected with some folks who had organized in St. Louis and Ferguson, and just immediately just fell into the movement. There were a number of student protests at my university at the time. There were a graduate student in my program who actually went on a hunger strike. There were about 10 students who were protesting the university, and it kind of like took off and spread, and pretty soon a significant percentage of the student body had joined in the protests, so much so that it caught national attention. And eventually the university's football team decided to decided to protest. And they said that they would not play the following games if the demands of those students were not met. So I was sort of caught in the middle of all of this. Like, I'm, down in St. Louis and Ferguson a year after Mike Brown was murdered. I'm on my, university's campus in a graduate program where graduate students and undergrads are essentially engaged in the uprising. And just seeing all of this just sort of like motivated me to continue to stay involved in the work and in the movement. And so when I was there for about a year, I didn't really like the program that well. I did well. I had like a 3.75 GPA, but I wasn't making enough money to just be able to survive financially. And so I decided to just take a break. I was really, really committed to my organizing work. And I didn't want to let that go, but I knew that I could always come back and get involved, or come back and go back to graduate school and finish my degree. So I decided to just drop out of my program and move back to South Bend and bring some of my organizing experience here, to get some changes made. I've been following Henry Davis Jr. for a number of years. Since I was like 19 years old, I interned with him, and done some work with him around some legislation and some nonprofit stuff. And so I thought, like, what better way to make an impact than to try to enact change at home? So I moved back here, August of 2016. There was a case, the Deshaun Franklin case, where a 17-year-old black boy was beaten in his sleep and tased by a white police officer, Aaron Nepper, who's a very embattled officer, has a long history here of misconduct. But yeah, I got involved in his case. He was actually beaten in 2014 or 2012, but it took a grand jury 4 years to decide on whether or not his and his family's constitutional and civil rights have been violated. And they did determine that they were violated, but the family was only awarded a sum total of $18 in compensation for the harm caused against them. And so that spurred us into motion. I connected with Daryl Heller at the Civil Rights Heritage Center, Blue Casey, Nia Okereke, Chanel Mayfield, Antonius Northern. And we launched a campaign called Fire Nepper, where we wanted to raise awareness around Officer Aaron Nepper's history of misconduct on the South Bend Police Force.
How does something like that even happen? Like a kid's getting beat and tased in his sleep. Like, what was the story behind that?
The story is that there was his brother allegedly had him and his girlfriend were in some kind of fight, and she called the police, and I guess alerted to them that he might be at the residence of Deshaun Franklin in his parents' house. And so they went there, but they entered his home without a warrant, and they didn't ask, to speak with him. They just went in and just started hitting him and climbed up on top of him as he lay asleep in his bed. And he tried to kind of resist, obviously, because he was asleep, and was awakened by an officer assaulting him. And so he was subsequently tased and then detained.
What a brutal story.
Yeah. But it's one that's common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, too common.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it seems like Black Lives Matter is kind of hitting a critical mass, it feels like. Does this feel different to you than in the past?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it does feel different now. I'll be honest. In 2014 and 2012, so in 2012, Trayvon Martin was murdered. That really is what spurred the Black Lives Matter movement nationally and globally. And then it sort of caught its second wind with the death or the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. But I wasn't engaged in BLM work at that time in 2014. But I did get involved a year after Mike Brown was murdered. And I can say that this moment here, based on my experience, it feels very different. And I think the reason why it feels very different is because of the circumstances under which George Floyd was murdered, and given the fact that there have been a number of officer-involved murders leading up to his. And it just sort of felt like, George Floyd's death was the straw that broke the camel's back, and folks are just tired. People are tired, and they want change. And I think where we are right now, it's so incredibly inspiring me. I'm sure people can just see how worn I am on my face, and I haven't shaved because I've just been so deeply engaged in this work. We're talking with so many young people here locally who are trying to find out how they can better our community and how they can overturn these issues. And in Indianapolis in particular, as one city example, 4 folks, including an unborn child, was murdered in less than 8 hours by Indianapolis police officers. Right. Mm-hmm. So there's all this tension that is building up. And here in Indiana, we've seen cases here in South Bend, Gary, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis. And it just to be frank, the murder of George Floyd, was really feels like the straw that broke the camel's back and has spurred folks into action. And as your viewers can see on my face, my hair is disheveled, I haven't shaved, I look a little tired. And it not because I'm worn out or exhausted, but because there's just been so much forward momentum right now, and so many young people here locally who are in their teens and in their 20s, like myself, who want to see change here locally, and they want to know what they can do. And we as Black Lives Matter South Bend, we make it our priority to make space for folks who want to get involved in the work, because we understand how important it is to organize. So this moment feels different because folks are tired and they want change, and also because so many more folks are involved in the work right now.
Yeah. Well, I want to focus in, we're in South Bend, Indiana right now. Can you tell me a little bit about Eric Logan? Who was Eric Logan?
So Eric Logan was a 54-year-old Black man born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. He was actually murdered by Central High Apartments, which aren't too far from your parents' house, on the night of Father's Day. And he was murdered by a 20-year veteran and sergeant, Ryan O'Neill. In a case of allegedly that he was burglarizing cars, although that has been disputed. The officers claim that he had a knife on him, a purse that he had stolen, and a radio. And when the officers approached him in the parking lot of Central High Apartments, he, according to them, held the knife up and was slowly moving towards the officers. They fired a shot at him. He did not back down, and apparently they shot him again, which was the fatal shot, and he threw the knife and hit the officer on his elbow. I can't remember exactly if he threw that knife after the first or the second shot, but I know they allege that he approached them with the knife drawn, and when they shot at him, he did throw the knife and it struck the officer.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a small thing to have to die for, too.
Right.
Is this officer still on the force? Like, is he still out there now?
So he's out here, but he's not on the force. He quit.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that he quit because they had found that he was soliciting sex workers while on the clock.
Yeah.
Just months prior, I think a month prior to him killing Eric Logan.
Mm-hmm.
And so he quit the force maybe about a couple weeks following the community outrage at the death of Eric Logan. And since then, we've just been working to get justice for Eric Logan in the form of police reform. So we've called for reparations for the family of Eric Logan. We feel that the city of South Bend should pay the family money for his loss. We also believe that there needs to be some kind of citizens oversight over the police. So we've called for a citizens review board, and we have a meeting today around proposed legislation to create a police complaint board that is modeled after the police complaint board in Indianapolis, and it also was inspired by the Citizens Review Board or Commission in Chicago. And lastly, we've also asked for the adoption of the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is essentially, I call it a test, but it's sort of like a tool that can gauge the mindset of an individual and help them determine where they are along the spectrum. There's like 6 different categories along the spectrum. Where they are along the spectrum related to cultural competency.
Mm-hmm.
So we've made those demands, those 3 or 4 demands.
Well, it seems like I've done some research about South Bend, Indiana, and I've heard something like 5% of police officers are Black.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so it's gone up a little bit recently because they recruited 2 more officers. But yeah, it was at one point, it was at years ago, maybe about right when Mayor Pete started, it was about 15% of the force was Black. Mm-hmm. And just for your viewers who aren't aware, about 26 to 27% of South Bend's general population is African American. And so yeah, in 2011, 12, 15% of the force was Black. And presently today, it's less than 6% The last figures were about 5.8 to be exact, and it might be a little bit higher now that they've recruited 2 more Black officers.
Yeah.
And that has, in my conversations with Black officers who have left the force, they have attributed the exodus of Black police officers to the fact that the city has not really listened to the concerns expressed by Black officers over the years, and they acknowledge that there was or is in fact a culture of racism within the department that goes largely unchecked. And when the city had a firm come in, a consultant firm come in and evaluate our police department to sort of try to get at the root causes of what the disorganization, disarray, and dysfunction within it, the Black officers were not consulted. And so they felt unheard and unappreciated, and so they left.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems like 2 big problems are just the culture inside of policing in general, and then the police unions. Like, it seems like it's very hard to fire a bad officer.
Right.
We had in Olympia, Washington, like in the last 2 weeks or so, we've had a lot going on in Olympia as far as activism, but we had a police officer who was standing with a group of like this militia group or something, holding up like white, like just racist hand symbols or something. And then that comes out, but I'm not even optimistic that officer is going to get fired just because of how strong the unions are. Do you believe unions are part of the problem?
Unions are absolutely a part of the problem. Unions protect officers. The city has to sign a binding agreement with the FOP, which is the Fraternal Order of Police. So when folks say FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, they are referring to the police union, for those who don't know. And so, yeah, they have absolutely huge influence, because they set the terms as to how officers will be disciplined, what their pay will be, what their training will be, and what goes into the duty manual. And so there's a legally binding agreement between municipal governments and the police unions. And so, yeah, they have incredible influence, not just here in South Bend and the state of Indiana, but all over the country. As we look at how unions and in other industries, other sectors of the labor force, how they have been systematically dismantled. When you look at, just labor, just like the building trades, when you look at the school teachers unions, they've been undermined by legislators for the last 30 to 40 years. But police unions, they have remained intact, and they still hold and wield an incredible amount of power that goes largely unchecked. And that's why it's important for folks to be engaged in this work, because here in the city of South Bend, I believe they renew their union agreement every 4 years. So when I returned to South Bend in the fall of 2014, they were in the midst of wrapping up and finalizing those union agreements. And so we had tried to have some influence in that process, but the city was not trying to give us any leverage. Fortunately, today we are in a different position as far as the movement. And now we are on top of the city and police agreements. So they are set to have those discussions this summer. And we are going to be applying pressure to ensure that they create a public process as they are negotiating these terms of their agreement.
Yeah, it needs more openness and transparency.
Yep.
I heard just, being in town here for a week, there's something about wanting to give the police officers a raise.
Yeah,
it seems just so much like now is not the time
Absolutely
to even
not.
be considering that. Like, what are you thinking? Give me a little insight to what's going on with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Movement for Black Lives, which is essentially a coalition of Black-led organizations, the Movement for Black Lives. So there's the Black Lives Matter movement, and then there is the Movement for Black Lives, which is, again, a coalition of Black-led organizations that have put forward a very substantive policy agenda and platform for the public to view, and for organizations across the country to organize around at the federal, state, and local levels. And so recently, in light of the death of George Floyd and Drayshawn Reed and Breonna Taylor in Minneapolis, Indianapolis, and Louisville, Kentucky, they have called for folks to support a campaign called Defund the Police. Mm-hmm. And that campaign, essentially what it means is that when we say use the term defund the police, what it means is instead of us paying or moving more public dollars towards policing, let's take dollars away from that police budget and let's move that into community programs. So I'll give you a more local, concrete example. So the city of South Bend last year in its proposed 2020 budget, so that budget is set the year prior to it being enacted, right? So in the fall of 2019, there was a number of budget hearings around, the spending priorities for 2020. So in the month of November, I believe it was, actually, no, it might've been October, the police had a hearing with the city council around its budget. Mm-hmm. And Chief Ruskowski, who is our police chief, essentially said that officers on the force do not feel that they are being appreciated. They don't hear enough appreciation from the mayor's office, from the city council, and from the leadership within the police department. And so he essentially said that, hey, look, like if we don't show our officers more appreciation and if we don't pay them more, pay them a competitive wage, then many of them might leave. And in fact, 1/3 or 33% of the South Bend police force is eligible for retirement. 33% of our officers have served at least 20 years on our police force. And so if they don't feel appreciated, they will leave because they've been under heavy scrutiny, given the fact that we launched this chapter last year and we garner a lot of national and international attention due to the fact that Pete Buttigieg was running for president and he was the serving mayor at the time. So what we have been arguing here locally is that instead of funding more police officers, because according to them, there's a police officer shortage here in the South Bend police force. So currently there are 223 police officers serving on our police force. In this year's budget, they have budgeted for 240 officers. They would like to be at 245 ideally, but they have budgeted for 240. What we are arguing is instead of paying out, hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring on more officers to meet that threshold of 240 officers, let's take that money that's set in the budget and let's move that towards hiring violence interventionists. Let's move that towards creating more programs for youth, like programs that you have in Olympia. Let's move those, let's fund those kinds of programs. That way we can begin to reduce violence so that we don't have to have police intervention. And so that's the call that we've been making really since last year. But this past Monday, a week ago from yesterday, the city council was set to vote on a spending bill to increase the wages or the salaries of police officers here locally by 2.5%. Now, I want to remind you that last year they did work up 2.5% pay increase or salary increase into the budget for this year. So as of the start of 2020, the police officers did receive a 2.5% pay increase. But now they're calling for an additional 2%, which we feel is out of step. One, because in the midst of all of this, police officers should not be getting a raise right now. Two, we have not received justice for Eric Logan. Three, our demands have not been met. The family has not been taken care of. So why should the officers receive a pay increase in light of all of this? And why should they receive an additional pay increase of 2.5% if other employees who work for the city of South Bend have not or will not receive a total of 4.5% increase in their wages and salaries? It just doesn't make any sense. It's not fair. And so we put pressure on the city council to pull or table the bill. We actually wanted them to demonstrate their solidarity with the movement because they put out this whole beautiful statement that they support the protests, et cetera, which was just a symbolic gesture. But we wanted them to demonstrate real solidarity by wielding their power, right? By acting. in the form of voting no on that spending bill. But fortunately, they decided to pull the bill while it was in committee.
Yeah. Well,
And
good.
that was good that it got tabled, because the point that we were trying to make was that officers do not deserve a pay raise at this time, or really at no time, but they
Yeah.
certainly don't deserve a pay raise right now.
Well, it seems like in any other job, it's like a pay raise is based on performance.
Right.
And, another issue that seems to come up all across the country is we have these body cameras, but they seem to always be turned off when someone's dying.
Absolutely, yeah. So in the case of Eric Logan, Officer Ryan O'Neal, who was a sergeant, again, a 20-year veteran of the force, he was equipped with a body camera. We had pushed for body cameras and a citizens review board back in 2016 when we were organizing around the case of Deshaun Franklin. Well, in the spring of 2018, the Board of Public Safety, which is the governing body that presides over officer training, promotions, hiring, firing, and police procedure. They had voted to purchase and adopt this body camera technology. Now, at the time, they had said that it was equipped with all of these features, that if an officer drives at I believe it's if they drive at 70 miles per hour or greater, then the body camera and the dash camera automatically turn on. If their siren is on and their lights are flashing and they open up their car door, the body camera is supposed to turn on. If the officer were to initiate or activate the body camera, it is supposed to go back and record 2 minutes prior to the officer turning on or activating the body camera. Well, in the case of in the case of Officer Ryan O'Neal, it was not activated. And in fact, I believe he actually manually turned the body camera off. I don't know for a fact, but I know that it was not activated. And there were questions as to why it was not activated. And they said, well, because it was not equipped with this feature. Well, you had reported out both on the public record at the Board of Public Safety meeting, and it was reported out in the South Bend Tribune that this body camera technology was equipped with all of these features. But then we found out after the death of Eric Logan that it in fact was not. And so that's a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, it's like, what is with these body cameras? Do you think they're intentionally turning them off sometimes?
Hey, how are you? Sorry, your neighbor was saying
Uh,
Look, based on my experience, and I've seen some weird cases, yes, they're turning the body cameras off. You know why they can do that? Because if you look at police policies, like here in South Bend, it leaves discretion for the officers to turn the cameras off or on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happened in the case of Officer O'Neal. We wanted him fired, but because of the policy that was set in place and adopted or passed by the Board of Public Safety, which is a 5-person or 5-member board all of whom are appointed by the mayor, they had left room for officers to decide whether or not they want to turn their body cameras off or on. And so immediately following the death of Eric Logan and this outrage and this, visceral reaction to his murder, the chief of police and the mayor were quick to issue an executive order demanding that officers turn on their body cameras when they have any interactions with civilians. And we had actually found out that summer, because folks have been reporting to us cases of misconduct with the police department following the death of Eric Logan. We have found that officers were not turning on their body cameras.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know South Bend got a lot of national attention over this last year with Pete Buttigieg running for president, and
Right.
You're not a fan. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so again, I've been organizing here for 4 years. I've had many different fights with Mayor Pete's office, primarily around policing, housing, affordable housing in particular, and economic development. And throughout, my time, or his second term, he just was slow to respond. I mean, it was a battle through and through all the way. And if we hadn't had someone like Councilwoman Regina Williams Preston, serving at that time, we wouldn't have been able to make the little bit of gains that we did. And Pete was just he was just a barrier the entire time. I mean, he did not want to acquiesce to the demands and the concerns of the community. And so we had to protest him. And so when he ran for office, folks, the national media, even prior to the death of Eric Logan, they were coming to South Bend to understand his record because he was a small town mayor. He had really no real national presence. I mean, he was known, but he wasn't as big as he is now, where he would be considered a viable presidential contender for the Democratic nomination. So they had started coming in pretty much as soon as he announced. And so all of last year, really, we had been engaging with national media, and we had contacts with them and had been in discussions with them about his record. But once the death of Eric Logan occurred, they came back in full force, and they wanted to know what the heck is going on in South Bend and what led to this. And so Mayor Pete had a major nationally televised press conference. I mean, it was televised live on CNN following the death of Eric Logan. And he had it at Washington High School, which is in the heart of the west side of South Bend, the far west side of South Bend. It's one of the blackest communities in the city, and that was a big mistake for him, or a big misstep, I should say, for him, because it didn't bode well for him. I mean, he got to see the real feelings of folks. I've said to I think it was a reporter with the Washington Post that he got to see the faces at the bottom of the well. To quote the late scholar Derek Bell, he got to see the faces at the bottom of the well, and they came out in full force and with a tenacity and a ferociousness that he had not seen before in his time serving as mayor of South Bend.
Yeah. Well, it definitely seemed like that hurt him nationally, or that became a big part of the national conversation around him.
Yeah.
And so it was definitely a big influence. I remember there was some event where I remember like Gladys Muhammad and some people kind of coming together to try to endorse him. And then it seemed like Black Lives Matter intervened. Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of what was your goal with all that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the press had called us and said, hey, are you aware of this campaign event that Mayor Pete is holding for Black supporters? Well, it was, I won't say who really tipped us off on it, but it's a very respectable and esteemed person who actually first alerted us about this event before the South Bend Tribune contacted us. And so they kind of put it on they put it on our radar. And so we attended. I mean, they said that, oh no, it was not a campaign event. Like they tried to say it was just it was a community-based event of Black folks who support Pete. And we were like, well, who are these Black people who support Pete? Because we haven't seen them outside of the folks who he pays one way or another, either be it directly or through an organization that receives funding from the city. And so when we got there, not surprisingly, there was a sign-up sheet that said Pete for America, Pete 2020 on it. That was the heading. And so we said, okay, I signed in and we said, okay, it's time to get busy. And we walked in and we didn't like what we heard. And we saw that, some of the elders who we feel have been bought and sold out for at least 2 decades, 3 decades now, they were speaking highly of him. And many of these folks, I've not seen them at city council meetings. I've not seen them engaged in these struggles that we've had with Mayor Pete. So in my opinion, they aren't really the most informed folks. So you have folks talking about how he built 5 houses on the southeast side, but didn't also mention in the same breath that he had knocked down hundreds of homes in that same community. And so why are we talking about 5 homes that have been built, in the last decade in that community when he knocked down hundreds? And so, yeah, folks spoke up and spoke out, and, people saw Igor Rodriguez really kind of lead the disruption, but really he was just echoing the voices of Black women in the back who were just angry by what they had heard from these handpicked, self-serving Black leaders.
Mm. Let's talk about Release the Tapes and kind of what the story behind all that is.
Yeah, so that goes back. Wow, I was an undergrad when that really took off. I think that that blew up right when Pete came into office.
Mhm.
There were reports about these suspicious tapes that contained conversations with officers.
So this
Who
was
actually,
a police chief recording the tapes, or?
no, so Daryl Boykins had been serving as the chief of police for about a year at that time, and his director of communications, Karen DePape, who had been with the force for 20 plus years, had discovered these tapes that contained foul and racially tinged language, and so she took the tapes and gave them to Chief Boykins, who was highly respected at the time and was the first black chief of police in the history of South Bend. And once Pete and his administration and the officers, the embattled officers who took this case to court, really, once they found out that these tapes existed and they were within the possession of Daryl Boykins, Mayor Pete put pressure on Boykins to resign. And then when Boykins decided against resigning, Mayor Pete moved towards trying to demote and ultimately fire him. And so, Chief Boykins stepped down, and the community was outraged and was pissed that he stepped down because they felt that he didn't do anything wrong, and he had been unjustly and unfairly punished. And so, ever since then, since 2011, folks have been calling for the release of these tapes, and they have been held up in courts. But a federal jury, or not a federal jury, but a federal circuit court out of Chicago, I can't remember if it's the 5th or the 7th district, they said that, hey, like, this really shouldn't even be in our court. This is really a matter best suited to be dealt with in the lower courts. And so they have essentially ruled that, it's kind of up to the lower courts, but we feel that these tapes could be played.
Yeah. Do you think it's really a legal issue, or is it just a political will issue?
Definitely a political issue that has become a legal battle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You think we'll ever hear those tapes?
I definitely think we're going to hear those tapes. The council has already said they want the tapes to be released. The current mayor, James Mueller, has said that he wants the tapes. He feels the tapes should be released. Chief Scott Ruskowski has said that since he's not implicated, he feels that the tapes should be released. So I'm hopeful that they will be released within the next year.
Yeah. Well, I know housing is a big issue for you. You've, collaborated with my mom on different housing projects. What's going on as far as housing in South Bend? What needs to happen, and how does it connect to your mission with Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, so affordable housing is a big issue here in the city of South Bend. There was a Yale study that was done that looked at eviction rates across the country and actually found that the city of South Bend ranked 18th in the nation as far as eviction rates. And most of those are among, single Black women with children. And we've been actively working around trying to create more affordable housing options here in the city. Your mom has really done, revolutionary work within the area of housing. But we feel there needs to be more work done along the lines of what she's doing. And also, we feel that given the fact that we have an issue with generational wealth here among Black folks, there's a huge disparity between Blacks and whites here. There's a huge gap in home ownership rates as well. About 35% of Black folks own their homes. So we feel that there should be dollars that are set aside to improve the conditions of housing here in South Bend. Specifically for our elders who are most likely to own their homes. We know that most of Black wealth in America is concentrated in folks' homes. And so we know that taking care of our homes is vital for the the long-term well-being of our families, the existence of our families. And so that's why we've made housing a priority in our organization.
Hmm. What about getting youth involved, or how does that relate? Because I know that's something you're passionate about too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working to get young people involved in the movement. We are fortunate enough now to be, an official chapter of the Black Lives Matter Network. So we can, we do have a greater ability to fundraise, and we are actually looking towards creating a fellowship program for young, aspiring, burgeoning Black activists here in the city of South Bend. And we want to recruit, 5 young people. We've identified 5 now, actually.
Hmm.
But recruit 5 young people who we will bring into this fellowship program and teach them the nuts and bolts of organizing within the city of South Bend.
Well, that's awesome. You're doing all this work.
Yeah,
I want to get
exciting.
back to local politics for a quick second.
Okay.
Um, Tim Scott, who was one of the kind of leaders on the city council, recently resigned.
Amen.
Yeah. And so, what's the story behind this guy?
Yeah, so Tim Scott. If you look at Tim Scott's legislative record, you'll find that he is linked to a lot of problematic and predatory code enforcement policies. um, so we were kind of like, we kind of kept that hush hush. We didn't really put too much pressure on him. But last year, during one of the police budget hearings, he had made a call for more policing in the NNN, which is the Near Northwest neighborhood, which is one of the most poverty-stricken neighborhoods in the city of South Bend. It actually sits in Census Tract 6, which is a very racially diverse census tract, but it also has a high level of poverty. About think about 50 to 55% of residents or households in that census tract live at or below the poverty line. So there's extreme, economic inequality there. And he had made a call for the police to bring more officers into that neighborhood because allegedly his neighbors were complaining to him about some purported drug activity. So we were really upset about that because one of our members lives in that neighborhood. She organizes in that neighborhood. She lives just around the corner from Tim Scott, who was the president of the city council. And so we were hot. So we went on the block, went in the neighborhood, and we talked to the guys. Well, she really did talk to the guys because she had a better relationship with them than I do. And kind of alerted them to the fact that Tim Scott, who's the council president, that he was concerned about them essentially being outside drinking and kind of hanging out, chilling late at night. That apparently their neighbors, were upset about that. Well, not too long, probably within the week after him raising that issue on the record before the council and the police department, they had officers out, at these guys' homes, and so that was a problem for us. We were pissed, to be frank. And so, when the police raises came up, when Mayor Mueller had sponsored and put that spending bill before the council, we said, hey, we know Tim Scott is backed by the FOP. We know that Tim Scott supports the police tooth and nail. And we know that we know that he's very powerful. He's the president, and he holds wide influence on the council and within the city of South Bend. And so we said, hey, look, like, we borrowed from, our comrades in BLM Los Angeles and BLM Indianapolis. And we said, we're going to go to his doorstep and protest him. We are going to bring the fire to him. That way we are sending a signal, not just to him, but any elected official, that, if you go against the wishes of the people of South Bend, then we are going to come to your doorstep and raise these issues. And we're going to put you on blast in front of your entire neighborhood.
Well, and it's like, can you be on your doorstep just enjoying yourself without getting the cops involved? It just seems like it's such a frustrating thing that it's like, can you just be without being harassed on some level? Like,
exactly.
It just seems really unfair.
Exactly right. And they do what everybody does. I mean, I'm in the neighborhood all the time, they're doing what everybody does. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you are in any community, people go out on their porch and they have a beer, might have a little vodka, have them a little cocktail or whatever, smoke a cigarette.
Yeah,
I mean,
smoke a
they
blunt,
are,
whatever. Like,
yeah, it's
it,
nothing. It's just everyday things that folks normally do in the United States of America.
yeah. Ugh. Yeah, in Olympia, it's interesting. We have a really strong activism culture.
Hmm.
Olympia is maybe a half or a third the size of South Bend.
Right. Hmm.
And usually it's like, everyone's marching through the day. And then by 11 o'clock or so, it really like pops off. Like people are breaking windows or starting fires, and the police are out with riot gear, and it gets real intense real quick.
Hmm.
And then I'm coming here visiting, looking at South Bend, and it seems like there's activism happening, but it doesn't devolve like that. I don't know. That was just an interesting observation. Like you're making moves and you're doing things, but it hasn't turned to like smashing windows or
Right.
tagging City Hall or something.
Right, right. And make no mistake, we do not condemn those actions of folks who
Mhm.
respond to violence in that way, because we know that the history of Black folks and poor people in America has been a violent history. And so we
Sure.
are in no position to tell people how they should or should not respond to their oppression and to the violence that has been inflicted on us for hundreds of years. So we don't condemn acts of violence and looting or whatever. I mean, if you want to call it looting, I mean, shit, the whole country's been looted.
Yeah.
We're on stolen
Yeah.
land.
If you look at our
So
history.
to talk about, I think we need to really complicate, our understanding of what it means for individuals, folks to be looters. But we don't condemn that, but we also, it's not something that we are going to lead. We're not going to lead people into, or rioting. But if folks want to rebel and they want to uprise in that way, then so be it.
Hmm. What do you think are your main like tactics that seem like they're working for you? Because it definitely seems like things are working, like
Yeah.
there's change happening.
Well, like I said, I mean, again, we've been doing this for 4 years. So, we have a better understanding of the process and the mechanisms by which policies are made and decisions are made in the city of South Bend. So we understand what the pressure points are, not just for, elected officials, but also for members of the mayor's administration. We know how to use the media and to use our platform to apply pressure. So we don't necessarily have to engage in acts of violence to move our agenda. We can go about it in a different way. But again, that works here. Those are the tactics that we employ here in South Bend. That may not necessarily work in Chicago, Indianapolis, Olympia, St. Louis, Ferguson, a number of other cities. It may not work there, but for here and for right now, it seems to be working and moving our agenda forward. And so that is, what we are doing. But ultimately, I can't say how other folks feel, but I can speak for Black Lives Matter and the folks who we work with. These are the tactics and strategies that we are using. And I mean, we're inclined to say that all in all, they've been working,
Yeah.
because what we hear from most people in the community is that we're doing a great job.
Well, it seems like change is definitely happening. What does success look like for you, both here in South Bend and around the country?
Oh my gosh, now that is a broad question. My goodness.
Yeah,
Wow.
however you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, woo. Reforms are cool. People are calling for reforms. We certainly want, we understand that defunding the police is not a revolutionary or it's not a revolutionary demand. It's a reformist demand. So, we want to see that happen, but that is just to get us further along the path towards freedom, absolute freedom for our people. But that is the ultimate goal, is that we want reparations. We want reparations to be paid to the families who have been destroyed and victimized by police brutality. We want reparations for Black people in the city of South Bend and across the country and across the globe, because slavery was a global system, a global capitalist system. Slavery is the basis of capitalism, slavery and genocide. So we want reparations for the families. We want reparations for our people. We want our folks to have the ability to control the hiring and the firing and the recruitment and the promotions and the training of police officers. We need to have community-driven policing. So those are just some are like, there's some concrete things that I, mentioned in terms of like, we want these reforms around defunding the police and funding and investing in our communities in terms of, violence interventionists and not more police and community programs. And then we also, we want to have community-driven policing. We don't want these officers who, by and large, do not live in our communities, do not understand our communities, do not understand how to talk to Black and brown people and poor people. We don't want them in our neighborhoods. We want to police our own communities. And we want reparations for our families, for our people here in the States, and for Black people, formerly and currently in colonized people around the globe.
Mm. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think's important for bringing up for this episode?
No, this has been an incredibly comprehensive and well-rounded interview, and I appreciate you coming home and taking the time to find out, what's going on in your hometown.
Yeah. Well, I commend you on all this work you're doing. And, just keep fighting the good fight. How can people get in touch with you or support Black Lives Matter in South Bend?
Yeah, so please follow us on Facebook, Black Lives Matter South Bend. Also BLM South Bend, @BLM South Bend on Twitter and on Instagram. So you can follow us that way, or you can email us at B as in boy, L as in lives, M as in matter. So I should say B as in Black, L as in lives, M as in matters, .southbend, all one word, @gmail.com. And please feel free to reach us today or at any point. Today is, the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of the death of Eric Logan. And so we are inspired, and we are ready to continue forward in seeking justice for Eric Logan. And we want as much support as we can possibly get. So please feel free, do not hesitate to reach out to us.
Well, keep up the good work, and I'll definitely be following and paying attention.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Again, just thank you, Jordan. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. And thank you for the work that you're doing in South Bend, Indiana to influence the community. Something has to change right now. It seems specifically the police need to change. There's clearly a culture of racism inside of the police department. And I think it's not just South Bend. It's not just Olympia. It's every police department. We can't accept that anymore. The racism has to stop. And I'm not saying every police officer is a racist, but I'm saying too many police officers are okay with racism, or at least not speaking out against it. There were several officers when George Floyd was murdered that were just standing by. That's unacceptable. And that lies on police, all police. I want to see you doing your part. You have to hold each other accountable. This can never happen again. So I just hope we as a collective people, everyone, are just giving our full effort to try to combat this. And, it's like, what are we going to do right now? Are we going to let things just keep continuing how they've been going? Or are we going to rise up and say, this was a time some real change happened? I hope the latter. So we'll see you next week. Thank you for joining us. Please give this a share, give us a comment, give us a like, subscribe, all that stuff. And we'll see you next week on the Bhive with Double B. Peace.